To the veteran fighter aces of the Luftwaffe, the men who believed they had mastered every corner of the western sky, it was almost comical. Eine fliegende Zisterne, a flying water tank. That was the nickname whispered over airfields in Belgium when the first American P-47 Thunderbolts began appearing in the summer of 1943. As the massive aircraft crawled into view, German pilots shook their heads in disbelief. The thing was grotesquely large, wide as a barn door, its fuselage swollen and awkward. Fully loaded, it weighed close to 8 tons, nearly twice the mass of their sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s. To them, it looked like an engineering joke. Slow, heavy, American. They assumed it would fall apart the moment real combat began. One Luftwaffe pilot later recalled, "We thought it was impossible that something so big could survive a fight." That confidence would not last long. Because the so-called flying tank carried 8 heavy .50 caliber machine guns, a brutal punch that turned brief encounters into executions. It was powered by an engine that thrived where German fighters gasped for air, and it absorbed damage that would have torn other aircraft apart. The laughter ended abruptly, usually in spirals of smoke. By mid-1943, the air war over Western Europe had become a ruthless contest of adaptation. The Luftwaffe still believed they were the artists of aerial combat, wielding speed and finesse like scalpels. Their opponents, they assumed, relied on numbers rather than skill. Into this finely balanced struggle entered the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. And at first glance, it seemed to confirm every German prejudice. But doubt wasn't limited to the enemy. When the Thunderbolt arrived at American bases in southern England, pilots were stunned. Units like the 56th Fighter Group at Boxted took one look at the aircraft and felt a wave of disappointment. Many of these men had trained in lighter fighters or flown British Hurricanes. Compared to those responsive machines, the P-47 felt like a cargo hauler. The cockpit was enormous, almost luxurious. But that space only emphasized how slow the controls felt. The aircraft resisted sharp turns. It bled speed quickly. Pilots joked that if you made a mistake in a Thunderbolt, you had plenty of time to think about it before you hit the ground. They began calling it the Jug, a nickname inspired by its bulbous shape. At the time, it wasn't meant as a compliment. The mind behind this controversial aircraft was a quiet but brilliant engineer named George Kartvelian, an immigrant designer working for Republic Aviation. His assignment from the U.S. Army Air Forces was clear: build a fighter that could survive against the best Germany had to offer. Kartvelian ignored conventional wisdom. Instead of chasing agility, he built his aircraft around raw power. At its heart was the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder engine, unlike anything the Americans had fielded before. To unleash its full potential, he integrated a complex turbo-supercharger system buried deep within the fuselage. The result demanded a huge airframe. When critics questioned the design, Kartvelian reportedly replied, "Yes, it will be big, but it will be a strong one." Big didn't begin to cover it. The P-47 weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty. With fuel, ammunition, and external tanks, it exceeded 17,000 pounds in combat configuration. Its primary opponent, the Bf-109, weighed barely half that. The consequences were immediate and alarming. The Thunderbolt struggled to climb. It could not win turning fights. It required long, reinforced runways that many forward bases simply didn't have. Early missions exposed these flaws brutally. During its first major combat patrol over occupied Europe, A planned escort mission fell apart before contact was even made. Faulty radio equipment forced the group to abort. When the Thunderbolts finally met German fighters head-on, the results were sobering. At that moment, it seemed the skeptics were right. During its first 8 weeks of combat, the Thunderbolts' record looked grim. American squadrons flew more than 2,000 sorties and could only confirm a handful of enemy kills, while nearly twice that number of P-47s failed to return. The Luftwaffe quickly cracked what they believed was the Thunderbolt's code: drag the oversized American fighter down low, force it into tight turns, and the outcome was almost guaranteed. Down near the treetops, the Jug was helpless. German pilots grew confident, even smug. To them, the huge American machine had proven every suspicion correct. It was slow to react, heavy on the controls, and incapable of dancing the way a proper fighter should. The nickname Flying Milk Bottle stuck, not as a joke anymore, but as a verdict. Morale suffered on the Allied side as well. Nowhere was that frustration more visible than in the 4th Fighter Group. Many of its pilots were experienced combat veterans who had flown Spitfires with deadly effectiveness. Being forced into the Thunderbolt felt like a downgrade, even an insult. They complained openly, convinced that they had been handed the wrong weapon for the war they were fighting. The Germans noticed. From Luftwaffe briefings to pilots' mess halls, the Thunderbolt was discussed with amusement, not concern. They believed they understood it completely. What they saw was a brute force aircraft, strong perhaps, but unsophisticated. To them, it symbolized everything they believed was wrong with American design philosophy: oversized, inefficient, and lacking finesse. They were certain this giant would never survive against true aerial craftsmanship. What they failed to understand was that they were evaluating the P-47 using the wrong rulebook. The Thunderbolt was never meant to win the kind of fights the Luftwaffe preferred. It was built for a different battlefield entirely, one that existed far above the altitude where German pilots felt comfortable. And once the Americans learned how to fight that war, the balance of power would shift violently. So why did the Germans misjudge it so badly? Because they focused on what the P-47 lacked, instead of what it possessed. The Thunderbolt's real strengths weren't found in tight turns or elegant maneuvers. They were buried deep inside the aircraft, in its engine and in the revolutionary system that allowed it to dominate the thin, frozen air above 25,000 feet. At the heart of the machine sat the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This was no ordinary power plant, producing over 2,000 horsepower and later far more with emergency power. It was among the most formidable piston engines ever built. At a time when German fighters relied on engines delivering roughly 1,500 horsepower, the R2800 represented a massive leap forward in raw output. It wasn't just powerful, it was brutally resilient. The Double Wasp was a radial engine, with its cylinders arranged in a circular pattern around the crankshaft. That design choice created drag and contributed to the Thunderbolt's bulky appearance. But it also removed one of the greatest weaknesses of German and British fighters: liquid cooling. Inline engines depended on delicate coolant systems. A single cannon hit could rupture a line, overheat the engine, and doom the aircraft within seconds. Luftwaffe pilots were used to watching enemy fighters trail steam and plunge earthward after just one well-placed burst. The P-47 didn't play by those rules. Its air-cooled engine could take astonishing damage and keep running, Pilots routinely brought Thunderbolts home with massive holes in the cowling, shattered propeller blades, and even missing cylinders. The engine kept turning. The plane kept flying. But power and durability alone were not enough to win air superiority. At extreme altitude, engines suffocate. Thin air starves them of oxygen, robbing them of power. Most fighters tried to solve this with mechanically driven superchargers, devices powered directly by the engine itself. They helped, but at a cost. What followed seemed almost impossible. As German fighters climbed higher, their engines began to choke. Above 25,000 feet, power bled away rapidly. Controls stiffened. Speed vanished. But the Thunderbolt was only beginning to wake up. The turbo-supercharged R-2800 thrived in the thin, frozen air, delivering full power where enemy aircraft struggled just to stay aloft. At 30,000 feet, the P-47 wasn't laboring. It was dominant. This was the altitude where American bombers lived and died, and it was precisely where the Thunderbolt transformed. The aircraft that felt sluggish near the ground suddenly became fast, aggressive, and alive. Energy poured through the airframe. German pilots who tried to follow found themselves trapped in a hostile environment, fighting physics as much as the enemy. The Luftwaffe had unknowingly stepped into the Thunderbolt's territory. The so-called flying milk bottle was revealing its true purpose. It was never meant to twirl through low-altitude dogfights. It was designed to stalk, strike, and disengage in a realm where most fighters simply could not function. And then there were the guns. If the engine was the Thunderbolt's heart, its armament was its personality. Loud, violent, and unapologetic. German fighters were built around a philosophy of efficiency. Fewer weapons, limited ammunition, precise bursts. The P-47 represented something entirely different. Excess. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns were mounted in the wings, 4 per side. This wasn't balance, it was saturation. When a Thunderbolt opened fire, it didn't feel like a fighter shooting. It felt like an industrial machine tearing the sky apart. At full output, those guns spat more than 100 rounds every second. Pilots didn't talk about aiming carefully. They talked about flooding a section of air with metal. With roughly 4,000 rounds on board, a Thunderbolt could fire continuously for close to half a minute, an eternity in aerial combat. German pilots, by comparison, were trained to fire short, controlled bursts. Their ammunition disappeared quickly. Miss once or twice, and the fight was over. The Thunderbolt removed that pressure. You didn't need surgical accuracy, you needed proximity. The guns were harmonized to intersect at a chosen distance, often around 300 yards. Anything caught inside that invisible cone, fuselage, engine, cockpit, simply ceased to exist. The 50 caliber rounds hit hard, flew fast, and retained lethal energy even after passing through armor. One German ace later described being caught in a Thunderbolt's fire as being dismantled by a factory. This destructive power sat on top of an airframe that seemed almost indestructible. The P-47 was not merely rugged, it was absurdly tough. The cockpit was encased in thick armor plating, forming a protective shell around the pilot. The massive radial engine absorbed punishment like a shield, and the sheer volume of empty space inside the aircraft meant bullets often passed through without striking anything essential. Thunderbolts returned to base missing chunks of wing, tails riddled with holes, engines bleeding oil, and still flying. Among the many stories, one became legendary. In the summer of 1943, an American squadron leader found himself isolated over occupied Europe. His Thunderbolt was jumped by multiple German fighters and torn apart by cannon fire. The canopy shattered. The cockpit filled with smoke. Flames licked across the fuselage. Wounded and barely conscious, he tried to bail out, but the damaged canopy refused to open. Trapped inside a burning aircraft, he pushed the nose down in a desperate dive. Somehow the fire extinguished itself. The Thunderbolt, shredded and bleeding, staggered toward the coast. That's when a lone German fighter slid into position behind him, lining up for the final shot. Under normal circumstances, the outcome would have been inevitable. But nothing about the P-47 was normal. With no guns left and no way to fight back, Johnson prepared himself for the inevitable. The German fighter made repeated attack runs, hammering the crippled Thunderbolt again and again. Tracers stitched across the fuselage. Metal peeled away. Somehow the jug stayed in the air. At last, the German pilot ran dry. Instead of delivering a final blow, he eased his fighter alongside the ruined American aircraft. For a brief moment, the two pilots looked directly at one another. Then the German rocked his wings, a silent acknowledgement of a man who should already have been dead, and broke away toward the east. Against all logic, Johnson flew that shattered Thunderbolt home. When it landed, ground crews counted more than 200 holes punched through the airframe. That encounter revealed the Thunderbolt's second great truth. It wasn't merely powered by a strong engine. It was protected like a fortress. Luftwaffe pilots, conditioned to watch enemies fall apart after a short burst of cannon fire, now faced something deeply unsettling. They would unload everything they had into the massive American fighter, expecting it to disintegrate, only to see it keep flying, stubbornly refusing to die. One German ace later admitted that shooting at a P-47 felt pointless. It could absorb an unbelievable amount of punishment and remain combat capable. The joke stopped. In their place grew unease. They weren't fighting a flawed aircraft anymore. They were fighting something monstrous. The Thunderbolt had never been weak. It had simply been misused. Early losses came from American pilots trying to outmaneuver German fighters in turning battles. That was the Luftwaffe's world, and it was a deadly mistake. Then the mindset changed. Commanders like Hubert Zemke, leading the 56th Fighter Group, understood a simple truth. You don't ask a heavyweight to dance like a featherweight. You teach him to strike with force and walk away unscathed. The tactic they embraced was ruthless and efficient. Boom and zoom. The concept was brutally simple. Avoid turning fights entirely. Instead, Thunderbolt pilots climbed as high as possible, often well above 30,000 feet, where their engines still delivered full power. From that lofty perch, they watched the skies below, waiting. When a German fighter appeared, the Thunderbolt tipped its nose downward. What followed was terrifying. In a dive, the P-47 became unstoppable. Its enormous mass, a liability during climbs, now worked in its favor. Gravity seized the 8-ton aircraft and hurled it downward like a dropped anvil. The jug accelerated with frightening speed, reaching velocities that pushed the limits of other fighters. Where lighter aircraft risked structural failure, the Thunderbolt remained solid. At over 500 miles per hour, it screamed out of the sun. Often the German pilot never saw it coming. One second the sky was empty, the next, it exploded with converging tracer fire. The Thunderbolt pilot had only moments to aim and fire before blasting past the target. Then came the escape. Using its immense speed, the P-47 climbed back toward safety, leaving its victim behind in chaos. There was no prolonged engagement, no elegant duel, just a sudden, violent strike and disappearance. This change in tactics transformed the Thunderbolt almost overnight. It became one of the most effective bomber escorts in the European theater. German fighters now had to fight their way through layers of prowling Thunderbolts just to reach the B-17s and B-24s of the 8th Air Force. Every interception attempt became more dangerous. By the end of 1943, German intelligence assessments had changed dramatically. The aircraft, once dismissed as clumsy and oversized, was now classified as a serious threat, and the Thunderbolt itself continued to improve. Another crucial breakthrough came with a redesigned propeller. The new wide-chord paddle blade prop dug into the air with far greater authority, converting engine power into thrust far more efficiently. The change was immediate and dramatic. Takeoffs shortened, acceleration improved. Most importantly, the Thunderbolt's once criticized climb rate surged. The aircraft that had struggled to claw its way skyward could now rise with confidence. German pilots, who once relied on climbing away from the bulky American fighter, suddenly found that escape was no longer guaranteed. The Jug could follow them upward, erasing one of its last remaining weaknesses. With these refinements, the P-47 matured into a complete combat machine. Visibility, climb performance, speed, durability, and overwhelming firepower now worked together as a single system. The ridicule that had followed its arrival faded into memory. When Luftwaffe pilots looked up and saw those massive shapes orbiting far above, there was no laughter and only tension. The air war had changed, and the sky no longer belonged to Germany. Then, in early 1944, another American fighter began appearing over Europe. The P-51 Mustang arrived with something no other Allied fighter could match: range. With drop tanks, it could escort heavy bombers deep into the Reich and back again. For many aircraft, this would have meant replacement. For the Thunderbolt, it meant rebirth. Relieved of long-range escort duties, the P-47 was unleashed in a role perfectly suited to its nature: the fighter bomber. To German troops on the ground, it became known by a single terrifying word: Jabo. The Thunderbolt's immense engine power allowed it to haul extraordinary loads into combat. It could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, rivaling light bombers, along with clusters of high-velocity rockets mounted beneath its wings. No other single-engine fighter in Europe could deliver that level of destruction and survive to do it again. The high-altitude Predator was reborn as a low-level executioner. In the months leading up to the Allied landings in Normandy, air power was tasked with one objective: shatter the German war machine before it could react. The P-47 became one of the primary instruments of that campaign. The results were devastating. Flying just above the treetops, Thunderbolts ranged across occupied France, striking the lifelines of the German army. Rail yards vanished in explosions. Supply depots burned. Convoys were caught in the open and annihilated. A single pass from a flight of P-47s could turn a road into a graveyard of twisted metal and fire. Their machine guns shredded vehicles. Their rockets smashed armor. Their bombs carved craters into airfields and bridges. Movement in daylight became suicidal. This was where the Thunderbolt's legendary resilience proved indispensable. Ground attack missions were brutally dangerous. Every run meant flying headlong into concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Small arms, flak, and heavy machine guns filled the air with metal. Yet the P-47 absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Thunderbolt staggered home with wings torn open, fuselages peppered with holes, engines leaking oil, and pilots still alive. Among airmen, a grim saying circulated, "If you had to choose, you'd rather crash land a P-47 than jump out of it." After D-Day, the aircraft became a constant presence over the battlefield. German armored units, once masters of rapid maneuver, were forced into paralysis. Any movement under daylight risked immediate destruction from above. The thunderous growl of the R-2800 engine became a sound of terror. German soldiers developed a condition they called Jabo angst, the instinctive panic triggered by the distant roar of an approaching thunderbolt. When they heard it, they scattered, knowing violence was seconds away. The consequences were impossible to ignore. Even Germany's senior commanders admitted defeat from the air. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, responsible for defending the Western Front, later fumed that Allied aircraft, especially the dreaded Jabos, had made any large-scale troop movement nearly impossible. Columns that moved by day were annihilated. Those that moved by night arrived too late. What began as mockery had evolved into something unstoppable. The Thunderbolt was no longer a joke. It was a juggernaut. But the triumph of the P-47 cannot be explained by technology alone. Its success was the result of a collision between two fundamentally different visions of modern warfare. The German system revolved around elite skill. A small cadre of highly trained aces formed the backbone of the Luftwaffe. These men were deadly, experienced, and irreplaceable. When one was lost, years of combat knowledge vanished with him. The American system was something else entirely. It was industrial warfare on a scale the world had never seen. The P-47 became the physical embodiment of that philosophy. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced more than 1,500 Thunderbolts. At peak output, a new aircraft rolled off the production line every single hour. It was a flood of steel and aluminum that Germany could not hope to match. While German industry struggled under bombing raids to assemble a few hundred fighters per month, American factories drowned the skies in machines. And this industrial miracle didn't stop with the airframe. The Thunderbolt's massive R-2800 engine was produced in staggering numbers, more than 125,000 units. Not only by aircraft manufacturers, but by automotive giants better known for building civilian cars. The result was a limitless supply of engines, parts, and replacements. A damaged P-47 could often be patched up and flying again within days. A destroyed German fighter might never be replaced. The same logic applied to pilots. As the Luftwaffe's training system collapsed under fuel shortages and mounting losses, American pilot training expanded. Before reaching combat, U.S. pilots accumulated hundreds of flight hours across multiple aircraft types. By the final year of the war, many German pilots were sent into battle with barely 100 hours total. The Americans weren't just producing airplanes. They were producing pilots, nearly 200,000 of them. Each loss was tragic, but the system absorbed it and continued forward. The Luftwaffe could not. Every experienced pilot lost was a wound that never healed. Then there was logistics. The P-47 consumed enormous amounts of fuel and ammunition, but America's supply network delivered it all without interruption. High-octane gasoline, spare parts, bombs, rockets, everything arrived in endless waves. This was a kind of war Germany simply could not fight because the Luftwaffe wasn't battling a single aircraft. It was battling the full industrial power of the United States. The Thunderbolt was merely the spear point, a hardened tip driven forward by relentless production, training, and logistics. Through attrition alone, it ground German air power down to nothing. By May 1945, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had secured its place in history. The aircraft, once ridiculed as a flying milk bottle, ended the war with a kill-to-loss ratio exceeding 4-1. It flew more than 500,000 combat missions, destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft, and obliterated tens of thousands of vehicles on the ground. Its journey from failure to dominance was not luck. It was adaptation. American pilots learned to exploit its strengths instead of apologizing for its weaknesses. Engineers refined it relentlessly. Commanders built tactics around what it did best. The Thunderbolt didn't become something it wasn't. It became more of what it already was: